Great. Well, good evening, everybody. I hope that you are able to hear me at home. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening. And an equally warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Tim Boatswain, Professor. We're looking forward to hear. Shall I? Okay. Apologies for the technical issue at the beginning. I hope you can now all hear me, and a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening. If I just go through quickly some items of housekeeping. For those of you on Zoom, if you do experience technical difficulties and need to leave for some reason or get cut off, you can use the same details to return to us and we'll let you back in. You'll notice that we put Zoom participants on mute and turn off cameras because that makes it easier for everyone to concentrate. And then at the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. So those of you on Zoom, if you'd like to type them into the chat box as they occur to you, then we will ask as many as we have time for at the end. And the talk will be recorded. So again, if you experience issues, you'll be able to catch up at a later date. So now to our speaker, and it is a pleasure to welcome back to the Study Centre Professor Tim Boatswain in person. Tim will be very familiar to those of you who attend our talks regularly. And this is the third installment of his very popular and comprehensive lectures on the history of Western art. As you may know, he has a formidable CV, having held academic posts at a number of UK universities, at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and at Harvard in the States. He's the president of the St. Albans Civic Society and chairman of Conservation 50, which does great work in the local area. And he's generously donating his fee to Conservation 50 projects this evening. He has already warned us that this talk is going to be the most challenging of the three, since he's covering the period when there was a move amongst artists away from direct observation towards self-expression. So we look forward to the challenge. Without further ado, thank you so much, Tim, for coming. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us.
Thank you very much, Nick. Well, good evening, everyone. I have to say I'm really quite nervous because this is the first hybrid talk that I've done. And it's very nice to have an audience, very select, I might say here, but also I'm quite nervous about how it's going to work. So do send in your chats, and my colleague Marina there will try and make sure the technical things work. One of the things I won't be able to do for you at home is point to things on the slide. I'm sorry about that. So you'll have to follow those through as I talk about them. As Nick said, this is probably the most challenging of the three talks that I've given because we're moving into an era where there's a lot more change and development, and we'll move right into the modern period where some of the art is quite difficult to grasp. And you'll understand why when we get there. Now, what I've done is I've divided this talk into 3 sections, and I'm going to do 3 sections at a time to take you down. And you may remember, those of you who were at the last talk, we were at the Renaissance. And I'm going to move us from the Renaissance into the next phase. Now, let's see if I can get the first technical thing working. Obviously not. I think, Nick, I might need some help here. If you could move on the slide. It didn't like it, no. And here we go. No? I think it may have frozen. Sorry about this, everyone. It's rare, actually, I give a talk where there isn't a technological problem. We've got the first slide. We're missing the top. Can we recover the top? And you can see that anyway, that we're starting, No. Yes. It looks like we're not able to remove that top, but it's not. Oh dear, it's breaking up. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. No, we need to go back, Marina. Back to the. No, we're going forward, so we need. Right, the first one, right? Now there's something wrong with the screen there. Can you see? Is it going out all right, Marina? Yeah, that's better, right. So we're going to start with Mannerism, which is an offspring from the Renaissance art that we were looking at. And you can't see, I'm afraid, because we've lost the top of that slide, but we're going to be looking at what happens to the Classicism and moves into the Mannerism. Then we're going to look at the Baroque, and you'll see there, it's quite interesting how the Baroque almost comes out of the social and political situation of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, some of you will remember from school, was essentially a religious war between the Catholics and the Protestants. And Catholicism uses the Baroque style very much to get across its religious message. Then we'll look at neoclassical, which is, again, quite an interesting movement in the sense that it's a moral movement which goes along with the revolution. And of course, a lot of neoclassical is linked to Napoleon and the empire style. And then we're going to come down to Romanticism. So that's the first section we're going to look at. So we're going to start with Mannerism, and we're going to start, if I could have the next slide, please. I hope you can all see that at home. It's not quite working here on the screen. I'm not quite sure why. I just have, excellent, just took some time. So you can't see at the top, I'm afraid, the dates of the Mannerism. They can see them at home, we can't see them. Oh, right, so you can see, oh good, we can't see them here. And I've chosen as my example of Mannerism, Michelangelo, because Michelangelo, you think of as a Renaissance artist, but in his later years, he moves into a much more developed muscular style, which is, in a sense, an exaggeration of the Classicism. We lose some of the clean lines of the Classicism, but we develop something much more articulate. And this is a detail of Jesus from the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. And it's the last period when he was painting this in 1541. So that's the last bit that he was doing. And I'm comparing it with Tintoretto, who follows on a Venetian painter. And as you can see, a century has passed, and Tintoretto is a very interesting artist. His real name was Jacopo Bruschi, and he chose Tintoretto because his father was a dyer, and so he called himself the Little Dyer, and that's what Tintoretto means. And his ambition, he said, was to use the colors of Titian and the physique of Michelangelo. So when we look at this painting, which is about the story of St. Mark's body being brought back to Venice. And this happened in the 800s, when some Venetians went to Egypt and they smuggled St. Mark's body back to Venice. And of course, St. Mark became the patron saint and so on and so forth. So very important. And he painted this for the Grand Scuola, the Grand School. And he uses Mannerism here in a way that is very dramatic. What you can see is in the foreground, Mark's body, which hasn't decomposed, which is of course a miracle in itself, and it was said to be very sweet smelling. And he's been brought back from Egypt, hence there's a camel. And if you look closely at the right-hand side of the picture, you can see a bearded face there, and that is Tintoretto himself looking on at what's going on. And all around is chaos. And the chaos around, and it's interesting, isn't it? It's almost ghost-like, it fades away. All around are the pagans being distraught by the thunderstorm that God has sent. And you might not be able to see it very well, but behind one of the characters, the elderly man, the white hair, behind him, there is a pyre. And the pagans put the pyre there to burn the body of St. Mark. And God intervenes and everything's okay. But what a dramatic picture. And this is really the sense of Mannerism. It's taking the classical, which is quite calm and refined, and it's jazzing it up to make it very dramatic. Next slide, please. So that gives us Mannerism. Oh, I didn't mention, of course, there's a nice little self-portrait of Tintoretto there at the top. And I've done that with all the slides. I've tried to put the artists in so we can get a sort of sense of who these people are. Next one, right. So we're moving now from Mannerism to Baroque. And Baroque, in a sense, is just heightening up the emotion of Mannerism so that it becomes totally theatrical. Now, on the left, we have, of course, the famous David of Michelangelo, calm, serene. If you weren't aware of the biblical story, you probably wouldn't be aware that he's about to fight Goliath and there's going to be a major battle and he's got his sling on his shoulder, but he's very relaxed. He's not a guy who's emotionally disturbed by this at all. And you can see there's a little portrait of Michelangelo there to indicate who the artist was. So there's Michelangelo and David, 1501 to 1504. And then the other side, we have Bernini. Bernini, perhaps the best known sculpture or Italian sculptor of the Baroque period. An amazing man. He was an architect, he was a theatre designer, a playwright, he did masks, he did everything. And he was a sensational sculptor, and we've got about 500 of his sculptures. Just an amazing man. Now just look at his David. His David is about to use the sling and his right arm is down. There's huge motion and emotion in everything he's doing. Even his face is in a grimace. Now, if we compare the two, down the left-hand side, we've got Renaissance, serenity, eternal, long-lasting. In other words, you can't put it in a particular point, particular time. Stability, very stable, full of horizontals and verticals. So if you drew the lines, and you can see actually just around the edge of the sculpture, there are lines, vertical lines, and horizontal lines. Calm nobility, reserved, quite detached from us. Who's he looking at? What's he doing? You know, is he gone for a stroll in the countryside, even though Goliath is towering above him? Idealized, very classical in that way, following the Greek and the Roman sculpture, classicized. And as you see, the green there, uninterrupted contours, and the contours again highlighted in red. Now, if we go over to the other side of the Baroque, what have we got with Bernini? And with Bernini, 1623 to 24, over 100 years, we've got emotional intensity, tremendously emotional, very dramatic. It's a particular moment in time. It's just as he's about to use the sling. It's full of dynamic, it's dynamism, and it's full of diagonals. Diagonals, of course, create the sense of movement. That's why Bernini is cutting across all the time to create that energy. Energy, movement, very involving, grips you. It demands that you engage. And of course, it's real to some extent. I think not idealized is slightly wrong because it's a sort of real idealized, because he's in pretty good shape, obviously been working out at the gym or whatever. But you've got constantly all the contours being interrupted, interplay. So you've got this sort of sense of emotion. And that is what the Baroque was about. Move the thing forward as if you were almost engaging in a theatre, as if you were there engaging in a theatre. Next slide, please. Now, what happens to Baroque is it moves into another stage, which, following the French word rococo, rococo really just means absurd. It just means goes beyond. It goes beyond what Mannerism is. And if we start on the left-hand side here, we've got Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Fragonard was a well-known artist who painted for the aristocracy. This is a picture for a particular set. And if you look at the picture, the swing, it's probably his most famous, and you can go and see it in London. It's in the Wallace collection. It actually demands a lot of attention because at this distance, you probably can't see it terribly well. But what you've got is a woman on a swing, beautifully dressed in pink. She's wearing a shepherd's hat. She's swinging away. Now, behind her, there's an elderly man pulling ropes for the swing. And in front of her, lying amongst the flowers, is a young man pointing up. In between, you've got a couple of putti, little angel-type figures, boy figures, looking up, gazing. And on the left-hand side, you've got a putti putting his finger to his mouth, silence. This is a private silence thing. And what's the story? The story is the husband, the cuckold husband, is pushing the wife out, much younger wife, out on the swing. She is being very naughty and showing her knickers to the young man who's pointing up. And just as a little bit of flirtation, she has flicked. Can you see her slipper? She has flicked her shoe, her slipper off. This is eroticism. This is a private thing about it. And we understand that it was originally commissioned by a man for his mistress. And the original artist refused to do it, the one first commissioned. And then Fragonard took it over. This is a private picture. Look at the lushness. It's all over the top. And it's frivolous and erotic. And in fact, Rococo's got a bad name for being rather too frivolous and not very serious. And of course, what it creates is a real counter-reaction. And if you remember going back to the time chart, we've moved into the period now of revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, Enlightenment about to start. The whole thing is in turmoil. Now, Louis David, who painted the next picture on the right, the famous picture of the Heratis, the Oath of the Heratis. This was a sensation when it was painted. It's very large. It's over 9 feet by 8 feet, a huge picture. And it was a sensation when he painted it. He's painting it at the time when there's still a monarchy in France. And he's painting for them. As soon as the monarchy falls, he joins the revolutionaries. He's a friend of Robespierre. He actually votes to have the king guillotined. And he's quite radical in his thinking. And this picture is a moral picture. It's a moral picture, and it's all about verticals and horizontals, and it's back to the classical world. What you've got is Horatius in the center with his 3 sons, and he's holding out the swords to them. And it's during a war between Rome and Alba Longa. And rather than 2 armies meet, they decide, the 2 cities between them, that they'll have 3 champions on each side, and they happen to choose 3 brothers. And on the Roman side, it's the Herati, and on the Alba Longa side, it's the Curiati. Now, that's very military and very strong. Sons sticking their hands out with that salute, which actually then was adopted by Mussolini. He became very keen on that salute. So it's very strong indeed. And if you look at the verticals and the horizontals, it's all about power. Even the diagonals are about power. And the vanishing point is right in the center where Horatius has got his hand holding the swords. So everything converges on that. Your eye automatically goes on that. But there's another side story taking place over on our right, on the left-hand side of the picture. And what we can see there are 3 women and 2 children. Now, this is the sad story. The first woman with the blue scarf, she is the sister. She is the sister Camilla of the brothers. And she is engaged to one of the Curiati who they're going to fight. So whatever happens, she's got a lose-lose situation. She either loses her brother or she loses her fiancé. The woman next to her is a Curiati who married one of the brothers. So she's going to lose. So look at they're in a terrible shape. The woman behind, we're not sure, it's probably Horatius's wife with the 2 grandchildren, but it's not absolutely confirmed. Now, just look at that group. What do you see in terms of shape? What you see are curves and circles. Whereas when you look at the men, they're all straight and powerful. So there's a moral story being made here, and feminists, put your fingers in your ears. The idea was that women put their family and passions first and did not have the moral fiber to stand up for the nation. And that was the whole idea, and because it's part of the revolutionary idea. So this picture, this neoclassical picture, follows the classical, hence neoclassical, and all neoclassical. Classis comes from Greek, just meaning a higher class. It's based on the Roman and Greek sculptures and reliefs. And that's what he's trying to get across. But of course, we've got a different composition in terms of the color, and we've got that emotional side of the women in the corner. It was a very powerful picture and became an absolute national favorite, particularly for the revolution. And you might say, although it's earlier than Napoleon, you could say it heralds the empire style of the Napoleonic era. So we've switched from the frivolous, over-mannered Rococo to this rather stern, moralistic neoclassical. Next, please. And what happens then? Well, neoclassical is too cold, it's too inhibiting, and as we move forward from that post-Napoleonic era, we move into Romanticism, where, particularly led by German artists, but I couldn't not put this picture up. This is The Fighting Temeraire by, of course, Turner. And it was voted in 2004 the nation's favorite picture. It's in the National Gallery, and I know that one of my colleagues has it on his wall. I hope he's watching tonight. It's an amazingly evocative and clever picture. It's not actually realistic, and Turner takes several liberties. For example, the most obvious one is if the Fighting Temeraire is being taken up to the docks, going up the Thames, what's the sun doing there? It can't be sunset, which it's supposed to be. It would have to be sunrise. Also, we know that the Fighting Temeraire, which was a famous second-class warship that helped save the victory when Nelson was on it, at the Battle of Trafalgar, it actually went up the side of the Victory when it was being attacked, so had a very good war record. The Fighting Temeraire was demasted and towed off for scrap. So the masts are still there, he's left them there, and there were 2 tugboats. We have an account. So we know that Turner is playing around in the same way that if I was showing Constable, we'd know that Constable will put a village here or put something there. They're constructing this, but of course they are making it much more like real life and making it much more emotional. This is a very emotional picture because it's the end of an era. The Fighting Temeraire, this great warship, is being towed away for scrap. And it also introduces the idea that we've got industrialization now. Look at the tug. This is a tug, a paddle boat tug with a steam engine, smoke coming out, blowing across. So an era has gone. The great sail warships are over. Now we're moving to something else. So it has that real emotional ring to it. And it pulls you in with this almost the beginning of Impressionism, which we're going to come. It's an impression in some senses of what it is, with that wonderful sky and the sun, which is supposed to be the sunset, and also just the way he's crafted the sea, so it's almost sheen-like. So this is Romanticism. You are making what you want of this picture. Does it make you feel sentimental? Does it make you feel, what does it make you feel? It's the end of sunset when the sunset's going down. It's a very human and emotional picture. And of course, Turner, perhaps one of our greatest artists, was able to capture through his vision and his brushstrokes how nature worked in all sorts of contexts. So this is an amazing picture, I think, and it's quite rightly, I think, voted as one of the nation's favorite pictures. and you must go and see it if you haven't seen it before, which I'm sure many of you have, in the National Gallery. 1838, beginning of industrialization, change in the world, everything happening. And of course, Turner himself, if we think of his personal history, and some of you may have seen the film that recently came out, Turner himself, of course, goes through that whole period. In the last years of his life, he was incredibly grumpy, very fed up, wouldn't talk to anybody. He was in a terrible state. It was almost like he's been taken to the scrapyard. Next slide, please. So we move from Romanticism to realism. Now, here's the chart just to show you what we're going to deal with. We're going to look at Courbet in a minute. Realism says, let's look at the real world, stop this artifice creating it. We'll see what it really looks like. And it creates a feeling that art is available for ordinary people. And it fits in with a social and political situation. European democratic revolutions, you can see over there, 1848, there was a change across Europe about the need for people, ordinary people, to have access to the arts and culture in a way they hadn't before. And in particular in France, this was demonstrated by a whole series of artists. Let's say we're going to look at Courbet. In France now, it's actually leading the charge in the development of European art. We move from realism to impressionism, which is a form of realism because it's plein air, it's out in the open air, it's looking at things, ordinary things, but it's giving a certain type of interpretation of it by saying, don't try and hide the brushwork, we'll move forward, we'll see how that works. And then there's almost a revolt against that, which says this is too insubstantial. Post-impressionism starts to look for something that gives meaning to art. So there's a meaning behind it, a symbolism that echoes and reverberates in the human mind. And then after that, we go in, as Nick was saying in the introduction, we go into people expressing their feelings about the world. And Fauvism and expressionism comes in. At first, it's about trying to express it in a collective way. Then it moves into Cubism and Futurism, which says, what's lying behind it? Let's deconstruct art and see what reality is. So that's what we're going to look at in this section. Next slide, please. Then. I hope I'm not going too fast. There we are. Now, the meeting. Oh, bonjour, Monsieur Courbet. Here is Courbet himself in his painting, with his painting gear on his back, his stick, and he's meeting his patron, Peter Daubré, and the servant. You'll see Marcel on the side, and Cassel on the side. Courbet was revolutionary in thinking that art was really something that people, ordinary people, should be able to engage with. Everyday life, things that just happen. So here he is meeting his patron on the road, and he's putting almost a photographic view. And of course, it's no coincidence that we're talking about a period. You think about, by the time Courbet's dead, 1870, we've already got photography. So we're moving to the idea that we want to capture real life as it is in a moment of time. This is a particular moment, absolutely as they meet. And it was scorned, of course, by many of the Academy at the time because they thought this was too mundane, too ordinary. Art should also be uplifting, and this was too dull. But what he was trying to capture was the whole realism of how art could interpret real life and not just make it up or manufacture it. Next slide, please. But realism did have to compete with photography, but also the sense of realism didn't allow the imagination to construct. And Monet, perhaps the leading Impressionist painter, with a school of other artists, rejected by the Academy, decided to set up their own salon. And of course, they had an exhibition there, which was the Refusé, the paintings that had been refused by the French Academy, and put up their own collection. And it was almost by accident that an art critic said, these artists just give you an impression of something. And so Impressionism then became adopted. And this is a painting that Monet did of Le Havre, his hometown, in the early morning. And what he wanted to do was to let you see the brushstrokes, not hide them, let you see the brushstrokes, which will give you the texture and the feeling of what's going on. And if you look at the sea at the front, or even where the sun is reflecting on the water, you can see the brushstrokes very clearly. He wants you to see how this is being constructed and to give you the impression of something, and your eye and your brain then makes up the picture. And of course, Monet has become incredibly popular as an artist because you are doing the work. He sets something beautiful in terms of color, but fragile, almost shimmering in terms of how you see it. And he got so excited by this, he would paint a particular scene again and again with different light to try and get the different shades and the different colors. So all his life, Monet was devoted to trying to understand how you could create an impression of something which then people would interpret. So Impressionism, very important in terms of the beginnings of modern art, because it goes away from actually observation to understanding. And the understanding really influences the next picture that I want to show you. Next one, please. And of course, this is perhaps the most famous post-impressionist of all, Van Gogh. Certainly the most successful in modern terms. You may have seen recently that a sketch of his was found and it's just been on display in Paris. Unbelievable his popularity, because he's appealing to something within our imagination. This is the Starry Night. He painted this looking out of the back window of his asylum in Saint-Rémy when he was undergoing treatment for a mental breakdown. And probably many of you know that when he was in Arles, he had this breakdown, he cut off his ear, he had a terrible row with Gauguin, he was in a mess. And he was a very sensitive person, Van Gogh, very sensitive indeed. And then, of course, later, when he was released, he went on and, as we understand it, killed himself, suicidal. This is slightly manic. The starry skies don't look like that, but think if you were looking through a telescope and you were looking at galaxies, what would you see? You would see these swirling stars. So in a way, there's a truth in here, which is untrue. The village does not exist if you look outside the asylum in Saint-Rémy. He made it up, and he put the church in. He's created something, but it gives you a sense, a feeling which goes far beyond just an observation. This is about his mind as well as ours. His mind is manic. It's all over the place. And it's full of motion, but it's incredibly exciting, and it has an impact on the observer. Engage with it. And look at those wonderful colors. Master of colors. Again, not afraid to show you the brushstrokes. In fact, the brushstrokes are an important part of the painting because he's creating all these different planes with them. A very exciting and stirring picture, which is probably one of his most popular because it just has this incredible impact. Next slide, please, in our whistle-stop tour. And we move on to real expressionism, and I've chosen out of that to pick on Fauvism because of Matisse. Matisse, such an unusual and exciting artist. And what Matisse was trying to do was to break everything down all the time into plain colors, flat surfaces even, and give you a sense of what is happening. And you have to, again, make up that reality. What really is going on? Now, he did the first version, which was a sketch, which is now in New York, but he was actually commissioned to do it by a rich Russian. And the second version is in the Hermitage. And it's very interesting because I think the first version actually has more impact than the second, and it's to do with the coloring and the way he's done it. The dance is very similar, the figures and the movement is very similar, but the coloring is quite different. And though the Russian version is much richer, the impact of these pale, naked figures moving around gives you this huge sense of dance. So art is moving away from strict observation to trying to express a sense of a feeling of what is happening. Next slide, please. And it moves to the point where we might say it wants to totally deconstruct the world. And here we're moving to the most famous artist of the movement of Cubism. Though this picture actually is proto-Cubism, it's not quite Cubist, and I'll explain why. It's a very famous picture which was very controversial, didn't get much showing at the time, and only really became of interest later. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is not the young ladies of Avignon in France. These are the ladies working in a brothel in the street in Barcelona. This is a picture of a brothel. And in his original sketch, he actually inserted two men. One was a sailor and one was an observer, as if it was him himself. But in this version, final version, he cuts them out, I think very sensibly, because he wants us to engage with the women. Now, what comes into your mind when you look at this? Pink, red, flesh, almost meat, isn't it? And if you look at the figure on the left, her right leg has turned into a piece of meat. So it's a moral, quite a strong moral sense that these women have been turned into objects of meat. This is a prostitute, this is a brothel. And he's distorted all their faces. Now, this is where he's borrowing, quite interestingly. If you look at the faces on the right, these are masks that had moved into Africa at this time, being collected as as France rather developed its colonial role in Africa. And these are African masks. And he's put them on almost in a way to shock. And then the central figures have Iberian faces, Iberian masks. And there's some dispute about the figure on the left. Some think it's more Egyptian, others think it's more Polynesian. But none of these women have real faces. They have masks. They're putting across because we're not being put in touch with real women. We're being put in touch with prostitutes working in a brothel. Now, what is he trying to do here? We all know that Picasso was a very capable artist in his early period, perfectly capable of reproducing what he saw. What he's trying to do is to break down what he sees into the reality behind the observation. The reality is, this is what we think of in terms of these women. And you'll notice at the front, there's some fruit, a melon, some grapes, pears. This is the enticement, this is the excitement. But what it actually ends up is women with blank faces, with masks. So we don't really see who they are or what they are. They have been, by their profession, turned into these pieces of meat. It's a very powerful picture. When you look at it, it's not aesthetically beautiful. This is ugly, ugly art with a message. And that was behind what Picasso was trying to do. And when you get into Cubism and some of it becomes almost uninterpretable, what he's doing is just breaking up, deconstructing everything that we know and giving us what he thinks is another reality, the reality behind it. After Cubism, next slide, please, we move into something that's quite crazy. He's broken down art, and people following him, like Paul Cézanne, try and find planes in the art. But then people say, well, what is art? Is it, where are we going? And you get people like Dada just taking simple, ordinary things and turning them into art. We've got the beginning of a revolution in terms of what art is, and people labeling things which we wouldn't necessarily think of art, ordinary things, but because they've labeled them, they become art. We're going to look at some surrealism in a minute, and of course we have to look at Dali. Then we're going to look at some abstract expressionism, and this is where it begins to get really quite difficult. And we're finally going to end up with post-modernism and deconstructivism, which is very personal indeed, and has that sort of feeling of Marmite for many people. Either they love it or they hate it. Let's have a look at Dali, the mad Dali, as I like to think of him. And I'm pretty sure he was pretty bonkers, if that's a fair way of describing it. Here he is, the greatest showman on earth, went to America and wowed everybody. And of course, he wasn't just a painter. He indulged in films and in decoration and things and artifacts. Many of you will know his famous lobster telephone and so on. He wanted to take what seems absurd and bring it into the real world. He was very interested, of course, and it was the era of psychoanalysis. He was very interested in Freud. He was very interested in what was going on in his mind. And I think he probably was a manic depressive himself. There were big arguments about how sane Dali really was. And certainly in his later years, he seemed to have lost a grip on a lot of things. What he's trying to do here, though, initially, in the persistence of memory, is conjure up what people dream about. Why do we have dreams? What are these crazy dreams for? What's going on? And are they a form of reality? And is perhaps our reality not as real as our dreams in terms of who we are? So the persistence memory of time, what he's done is he's taken a series of clocks, put them in a sort of barren area with a little tree, and he's melted the clocks. It's completely bizarre. It's really strange. And you think, well, what's going on? What is going on in this? How is this persistence of memory? What he's saying is about time. This could be out of a dream. And that's what he's trying to convey. Then over on the right, this amazing picture, which is much more real in a sense, but the angle is quite bizarre and unusual. It's almost as if there's a drone looking down on Christ on the cross. And it's an amazing picture because it tunnels you right down through the V of Christ's arms, takes you right down so your eye just follows it down. It's very powerful in the way that it puts across the suffering, but also something mystical and spiritual about Christ on the cross. And then finally, one of his latest, if not, I think his latest picture, The Swallow's Tail. And this is all about chaos theory. And it's about René Thom's theory of chaos and the different elements of it. And you can see he's taken patterns that were used in equations. The most interesting one, I think, is the musical one on the left, which is almost the cello shape. He's taken these, and of course he couldn't resist, in a way, putting a moustache in there. It's completely mad, and without actually understanding what Thom's was getting at in the chaos theory, it's impenetrable. But it's engaging, and it does draw you in. But it's about Dali's mind and what is going on in Dali's mind. So surrealism isn't about the real world, but it is about a world, and it's about the world in terms of his mind and other people's minds, about dreams, about psychoanalysis, about who we are. Next slide, please. Abstract expressionism. Now, this is the sort of picture that you will say my cat can do at home. Jackson Pollock, the American school at this time was moving into all sorts of abstract art. And abstract expressionism was simply Jackson Pollock, putting a canvas on the ground and dripping paint over it. You say, well, my cat could have done that. Why does that sell for hundreds of thousands of pounds? Because it has the name Jackson Pollock, and he was the first to do it. And there is an interesting thing about the art world. The art world, in a sense, is an introverted world where the art critics, the art historians, the collectors make the label that says this is art, and not someone who's just tripped over a can of paint. It's interesting, this one, and I've always been amazed that this is actually in Iran, in the museum in Tehran. And you would think, well, would the revolutionary government really agree with this? But there on the right, you can see Jackson Pollock at work, and he's methodically going round, spraying and interweaving. And gradually you see, if you look at it, it's a network, and you can be sucked in. It's almost neural network in the way it operates, the mind's network. An extraordinary idea, which you would think, well, could almost be an accident. So what is he doing? What is he actually doing? He's just expressing his feelings himself. And we can stand back and say, well, we can engage with that, or it doesn't mean anything to us. It's just tubes of paint being spread around. And expressionism moves in a way from trying to understand the expression of being human to the expression of the individual, what the individual feels. And art has become very much an individual practice. In the past, say for the Renaissance, it was for the patron. You painted something the patron wanted, and the patron called the tune. Now, it's up to you as the individual artist, and you don't care whether people like it or you don't like it. Of course, you'd like it to like it because you can get some money from that. But as an artist, what you're trying to do is express yourself. That's where we've moved to. Next one, please. There we are. And this is where it almost gets up the public's nose because it becomes almost absurd. And some of you will be old enough, perhaps, to remember the pile of bricks in the Tate. There it is, Carl Andre's pile of bricks. Is it a work of art, or is it something you trip over? Because he calls it a work of art, it's minimalist art. This is postmodern. I'm calling this a piece of work of art. The Tate bought it, puts it on display, and it becomes a work of art. And then it gets even more absurd. And we think of the Turner Prize, and we think of art in the Tate, and where we go, it's an unmade bed. It's Tracy Emin's unmade bed. Now, this was sold eventually. The Saatchi Gallery, do you know how much for? Anybody have a guess? 2.5 million for an unmade bed. Well, I would be prepared to do it for just 50 quid. I'm really cheap. But there's a story behind this, of course, and it's the personal. Tracy Emin was going through a very bad time at this time. She stayed in the bed for 4 days. She only got up to have a swig of alcohol. Everything is a pile of mess. Some of it's quite, I won't go into the detail of the mess because some of you may find it offensive, but it was a pile of stuff, and it's an unmade bed. So how is this a work of art? Well, it's a work of art because the people at the Tate said this is a work of art, and Tracy Emin said it's a work of art. And so that collective view of the art world imposes the label. And of course, this is where, say, it becomes very tricky, because what, is a work of art? What is a work of art? And it is a form of Dadaism. If we go back, there is a root there. Some of you will remember, and I didn't show it, but Dada's most famous work of art was a male urinal, which he just put armut on, and that was taken as a work of art. And he, of course, was doing it with tongue in cheek. And maybe Tracy Emin was doing it a bit tongue in cheek. But the idea was that this is about me. And art is becoming more narcissistic in terms of its expression. Next one, please. Installation art. And I thought I'd put this up. It should have been originally animated, but I'm afraid we couldn't get it to work. But those of you who went to the exhibition will know that all these toys, at the Cabral Mechanical Theatre, all the toys in front, all twirl around at the same time. It's quite engaging and quite clever that they don't hit each other and so on. They all twirl around. And this is installation art, which has become more important. Some of you will have read that the famous Bulgarian artist, Christo, who's now dead, had one of his projects finally completed this week. And that was the covering of the Arc de Triomphe with sheets of plastic. And if you look at the Arc de Triomphe, it's still there, covered in plastic. It cost £12 million to cover it in plastic. And you might say, well, what was the point of that? That was Christo's form of art, covering buildings all over the place. And it was seen as something interesting. And it is quite interesting, though, again, I think it's quite controversial as to whether you call that a work of art. The concept of doing it, and of course, they had to do a lot of underpinning so that they didn't damage the Arc de Triomphe is quite an engineering feat in itself. But whether that's art, well, it's a moot point, isn't it? Next one, please, installation art. And that's it. My final piece, this postmodern, this is Cindy Sherman. And what she specializes in is performance, performing different roles. She's a clown over here. There are hundreds of her pictures of herself dressed in different costumes, performing different roles. It is, if you like, the ultimate in narcissistic art. It's all about her and the different roles that she can play. Or you might say, well, it's not about her, it's all about all the outside roles that they are. But her latest, of course, art is on Instagram. And social media now is a vehicle for art and will be seen as a vehicle for art. It's intensely personal. It's about an individual expressing themselves. And we could admire it, we can look at it, and there'll be mixed opinions. Some people will see it as important art, others will perhaps see it as just posturing and posing. It's interesting. But this is where we've reached in terms of our long journey. We've gone from the art of people living in caves, hand decoration, animals that they are hunting and killing, and are seen having a very important spiritual process of capturing those animals by cave paintings. And we've moved through a cycle then of art having very much a theological role, to art then being seen as something that you procured for your status, when the medieval art that we saw. And we've moved into the modern era where art has moved, I think, from trying to see the world, to understanding the world, to understanding ourselves, to expressing ourselves. We've finally arrived from the origins of Western art to the end of Western art. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. I hope you're not spinning. I've just done a little plug for my next talk, which will be on the 25th of November about the Armenian Church. Now, you can hit me with some questions.
Fantastic, Tim. Well, that was a real tour de force. So thank you very, very much indeed. And what we're going to try and do is to see if we've got some questions online, which I think we have. The first, we'll look for those in a moment. And while we get them up on the screen, I wanted to ask, if I may, what you managed to do very, very cleverly is to pick out largely one picture, occasionally two, once I think there were three, to demonstrate one particular period. How difficult was it to choose those particular pictures? Or was it fairly straightforward?
Well, there were bits, and some of you will know that and I've got my colleague here where we did a talk about pre-Raphaelites and so on. And it was very difficult for me not to put the pre-Raphaelites in. But in terms of major movements, what I was trying to think was a European theme, Western art, rather than any specific area. And so I was guided very much by the history of what was happening to try and link that up with the art of the period. So that there was a sense, because sometimes it's quite difficult to get your mind as to what is happening when. And that's what I want to try and they are there. And it does show, I think, it showed to me in a way that I hadn't perhaps seen before, particularly this last period, of how history and cultural history and social history intertwined. I mean, it's an obvious point in a way, but to actually see it spelt out was interesting.
Absolutely. And if you were to choose a personal favorite from those, do you have a particular one?
Oh, gosh, that is such a difficult question.
It is.
Because it is a bit apples and pears in a way. And so I've never really found, there's one, I suppose that the solution would be, you're offered these, which ones you're going to put on the wall in your house and things. I think I would have to have the Starry Sky because it is just so emotional and resonates. And it's also linked, isn't it, to the sad story of Van Gogh, this genius, actually better known during his lifetime than people think. There's the rumor he only ever sold one picture, which is not actually quite true. But his engagement with trying to fight the demons, his own demons, but at the same time portray something, I think he'd have to be there. I think he'd be there. One of the artists I would also like, in that era that I didn't show, who I love, is Paul Cézanne.
Yes.
And he is doing, he's trying to break down reality into planes and colors, but it's so powerful, I think, his art. So one that was there, one that wasn't.
Perfect. And obviously you talked about the importance initially of the patron and moving now to a situation where there aren't patrons, or if there are, they're relatively scarce. And so you're putting your stuff out into the public domain and hoping that somebody likes it, which is a scary thing, I suppose. Van Gogh, for example, wasn't very well known in his own lifetime to the extent that he had patrons and had a lot of money, was he?
No, I mean, he was always supported by his brother.
Yeah.
And his brother, was his agent and his art dealer. And actually, a lot of the way artists are discovered is through art dealers having a nose for something new that's going to happen and become popular. And then, of course, art critics can write it up. And Pollock, Jackson Pollock was written up by an art critic. It was virtually unknown and people weren't interested. And he found himself written up, and then that article just, I'm just trying to think of the agent's name, Blackheath, just took it away. And that's so you need someone to promote you and push you forward. And of course, it often has happened to artists that during their lifetime, they're little known. And then when they die,
yes,
someone rediscovers them. And suddenly their pictures become real objects of value. Because that's the other part of art, modern art, in a way that it wasn't quite, it was, of course, it was about your status and about your wealth in the past as a patron, but now it's actually an object which you can exchange. So, there are masterpieces sitting in Japanese banks because they are objects of value. And that's a sad thing in a way, because then they don't become available for the public to see and give their view on it.
So just going back a bit, the art dealers have all sort of become the patrons of today, is what you're saying.
They're very important.
We've got a question on the chat. How do you foresee the future development of digital art?
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? And in a sense, I think there are formats. Hockney put on an exhibition quite recently where he was using, I think, correct, it was an iPad, but it was using digital art. And of course, it has its limitations in terms of, but although he's quite a flat style painter anyway, they were very flat. But of course, they had a luminosity, which you get just in the way of looking at some of these pictures tonight. You've got a luminosity, which is quite exciting. And yes, I mean, it won't be long before artificial intelligence will be giving us some masterpieces. It seems to be inevitable.
Do you welcome that?
Well, no, each age will have its own. What is interesting, I think, when you look at, and it was a sort of whistle-top tour, when you go fast that way, you see the styles changing, and sometimes they're reacting against what's happening, like neoclassical against Rococo, and then realism against neoclassical, and so on. You get the tension. So it's difficult to predict where we're going to be. What will be interesting is, is there a COVID art? What has happened? There's been a lot more art going on, I suspect, behind closed doors in homes and so on. Is that going to have a resonance as well? Because of course will have a huge association with a particularly difficult time for the world and for individuals. So that will be interesting. But digital art, yes, I think there will be a future for digital art, inevitably. And it will create different standards and different views again. But what we've seen with the art world, just because it's become so available to people, is this fragmentation. And postmodernism is a tremendous fragmentation into different areas. And you like it or leave it.
Absolutely. Why did France become so significant in the development of modern art, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. And I think, again, it's about social revolution. If you take even, we'd start with David, for example. You've got a whole change going on in the Western world, and particularly, of course, in France, and that revolutionary idea, and morality and honesty, and all of those things are a reaction to the decadence of King Louis's court and what's going on in the monarchy. Then when you come to realism under Courbet was at the Paris Commune. And in fact, Courbet spent 4 years, I think I'm right in saying, in prison before he then left France to go to Switzerland. So that was linked with that, realism was linked with the sort of politics. And France was a leader at that time in a way that you could say certainly you could say Britain was more old-fashioned. We kept our monarchy. We were much more stable, more traditional, and we didn't have that revolution in the same way. We'd had a revolution earlier, of course, but we didn't have that revolution at that time, which linked in, and I didn't really mention it, but I should have done. You were linking it in with Enlightenment.
Yes.
And the whole rediscovery of the classical world, of science, and things moving forward. So France was a leader in that, I think, and that's why French artists just were determined to try and disentangle, if you like, the world and reflect it in a new way.
So we've had this rediscovery of the classical world a couple of times over history, haven't we? Do you think that will happen again in the future? Or do you think that now with digital technology and so on, that we're past that?
Well, in a way, you see, digital technology, if you think of the art, I mean, that's just think of the Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson, and what he's done with CGI and how he's created a form of art there. So it is, you know, cinema is a form of art in that way and will be as perceived as that. And I didn't even touch on that really. I was sticking very much because otherwise it could have gone everywhere. But so there will be the way you can manipulate digitally will become a means of art. Oh, it's already become a means of art, in fact. We're already there. You know, the place I would advise people, if they want to watch where things are moving forward fast, is go to advertisements. Advertisements are very practical because they want people to buy things and they have to catch on. Advertisement that doesn't work just fails. The advertisements, and of course we saw that even with you know, some cinema directors, they would often start their lives doing advertisements and videos and short things and then move into proper long films. But that's an area where you've got to get immediate appeal and it's got to work. Some of it, of course, you know, you're grown at because it's so cheesy, but there are other innovative things that are really interesting that are going on in that world. So in terms of the digital, yes, I can see that happening.
That'd be interesting. Any questions from the floor?
Well, I have one. So, just this, Tim, you gave us a picture early on of the war, the 30 Years' War, and how the Baroque arose as a Catholic expressionism of what they wanted to display as the Catholic cultural movement. What happened to Protestantism? Because I thought that was missing.
Well, because Protestantism was very pure and didn't want things in churches, didn't want decoration, well, pulling it down, as we saw with the Abbey here, it didn't want sculptures and things. So the counter-Reformation, in a sense, was to glorify it and overblow it. So you only have to go into a few Baroque churches to think, wow, you know, this is over the top. But that was the message. The counter-Reformation was in that sense. So Puritan Protestant art is pretty non-existent in that sense because it wasn't valued as because art was so tied into religion.
I thought maybe Rembrandt and the Flemish artists of that period were what was something that would arise out of Protestant art.
Well, that's a fair point, and particularly that whole area, the lowlands, the Netherlands, was very much engaged in trying to create a form of reality. And you might say Rembrandt was, particularly, I suppose if we think of the Night Watch, you know, he's celebrating a Protestant union by giving them the portraits. So he was very focused on that form. And I didn't really talk a lot about portraits, though I showed portraits of some of the artists. But I think, yes, that would be a fair point. You could say that would be more of that focus, whereas the Catholic art is still about lots of religious pictures and stories of the Bible and so on.
Lovely. We do have time for a few more. So if anyone else online would like to contribute, I have a question here from Andy, which says, do you think that artists from different eras would be aghast at artistic endeavors from different periods? Could or would Michelangelo admire Dali's work, for example?
Yes, that's a very good mischievous question.
Great
Thank
question.
you. Thank you, Andy. Who knows? The problem is it's always the same, isn't it? When you're out of the context of a time where your cultural influences are so different, you can't really, what we can do is stand back and admire what was going on in that time, but we can't really engage in what it felt like in the same way. And I get, you know, Michelangelo, it's the time machine drops him in to meet Dali. What an interesting conversation they would have. I think Michelangelo would probably get bored very quickly and walk out. And Dali would be doing some sort of theatre somewhere or other. But in a way, they both had an eye for the dramatic. Because if you think of particularly that east wall of the Sistine Chapel, it's incredibly dramatic what's going on, even though the figures are quite classical and calm. It's a quite a sort of strange mixture, but what's going on, particularly those dropping down into hell, and the boatman with his oar, and all of these things are, if you can picture that, is very dramatic indeed. So they like the drama of each other, but I don't know whether they get on. Can't really say. Can't really say.
No. At the moment, I think the Royal Academy has its summer exhibition, doesn't it?
It does.
Where you have a whole range of different styles of art side by side. Is that something that you enjoy to see?
Well, we're due to go off and see it.
Oh, you are?
Yes,
Good.
this Sunday, I hope.
Okay.
And yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. I mean, you have to be quite selective. It's actually very good for using the quick eye, is what I call. I mean, when I go to an art gallery, I do a quick tour. And then I go back to what I really want to look at. Because otherwise, if you try and do each painting, each object, each work of art, you're dead by the end. It's because you. So I think the summer exhibitions, you need to whiz around, quickly say, oh, I want to go back and see that. And yes, I'd like to see that again. And do it that way. If you try and work your way around it, it's impossible. There's just too much. And they're so divergent as well in different things. Absolutely. But I think it's a great institution because it encourages. And we're all potential artists in some way or other. Even your cat, you know, do a bit of. So it's really good for us to be able to express ourselves in that way. And I think it encourages people to have a go. And when you look and say, well, I could do that, well, go and do it. Yeah.
And having different curators who bring different perspectives.
Yes. Yes. There's we talk about the art world, and sometimes it's a little bit irritating. It's a little bit precious. And sometimes, the emperor doesn't wear any clothes. And I think that has to be said sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions? I don't think we have any more online, do we? No. In which case, I think I will wrap up and say, Tim, thank you very, very much for your time this evening. I think you have done a splendid job to cover so many periods, but actually say something very profound and interesting about each of them so that we have a really good perspective of the last, how many 100 years did you cover in total? It was a lot, wasn't it? So many, many thanks for your time. And we look forward to hearing you again, as is on the screen, on the 25th of November, on a very different topic.
Yes.
Is there anything you want to just briefly say about that topic?
Yes, well, just some of my wonderful dedicated followers will know that I've done various things. And back in my early life, I did Byzantine studies as a student. And one of the things I got very interested in was Byzantine art and Byzantine architecture. And there is a strong link between Armenia and Byzantium. And the Armenian church claims to have been the earliest church, founded in the 4th century, state church, I should say. So it was founded before even Constantine committed the Roman Empire to Christianity. So it has a very early pedigree and a very interesting pedigree. But if you look at just this example, this monastery church, it had a lot of centrally planned buildings. And some of you, no doubt, will have been to Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, and seen the Hagia Sophia and the dome there. And it's often thought that that wouldn't have been possible without Armenian, and certainly Armenian architects restored it when it collapsed on 4 occasions of the dome for understandable reasons, or parts of it did. So the Armenian influence in Byzantium was very strong. So that's how I got interested in it. But I was also interested in the theology of it because some of you will know I did teach here on the certificate of theology, where I was teaching heresies. And of course, the Armenian church would be perceived as heretical because it was not quite monotheistic in the sense that it was monotheistic, but it wasn't quite monophysistic in the way that some Eastern churches were. But it has an interesting different theological view. I was really interested today. Someone actually used that metaphor and said, we're arguing about things in the way that church fathers did in the 4th century. And the Armenians were part of that argument. So that'll be interesting.
Well, that will be fantastic and very interesting. And I hope you can join us then. So thank you for joining us at home. Thank you for joining us in person here. And I will finish with the comment that Sarah makes online, which is excellent as ever. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. And next time I might see you all in person. Who knows?
Lovely.
Thanks, Nick.
We can talk now.
Yes.
That was fantastic.
Good.
Thank you very
No,
much.
thank you for your kind
I really,
words. Good.
really enjoyed that.
Good.
And I wish I'd seen the other ones.